One expert says the U.S. and the DPRK are playing a dangerous game with missiles, guns, and big ships. He is Rodger Baker, the Vice President of Asia-Pacific Analysis at the international intelligence company Stratfor, and he is joining us now via Skype from Austin, Texas. Rodger, let's get to some of these responses, different approaches, but before we do, I'd like to ask you and get your thoughts on the estimation. What does the DPRK want? They obviously have the world's attention. What's the goal here?
I think there's a two-part goal that the North Koreans are trying to achieve. Number one is the concept of regime stability and regime security, the idea that they feel they need a defensive capability to convince the United States not to interfere either militarily or through some form of color revolution to overthrow their regime. I think the second part that's expanded in what North Korea is looking for is a way to reshape the regional security environment. In other words, to convince the South Koreans that the U.S. security alliance is not actually giving them the protection they need, get the South Koreans ultimately to ease the United States out and come to some sort of accommodation with North Korea, and build towards that unified, more powerful Korea on the peninsula.
Is it an effective strategy?
It's not entirely clear that it's an effective strategy. The United States has emphasized that it has no intent of accepting North Korea's nuclear program or leaving the peninsula anytime soon. And in fact, it looks like it's trying to add military assets there. But from the North Koreans, I think that they're looking at long-term options. And that's sort of what they see. Maybe it's no less ineffective than the U.S.'s attempts to sanction North Korea to death.
Okay, let's talk about that. Putin says they're useless, ineffective. So far, they really haven't made much of a difference. Will more sanctions have an effect?
It really doesn't look like more sanctions are going to have a substantial effect, at least not in the initial decision-making by the North Korean government. And they may only be 18 months to 24 months away from having a very clear, demonstratable long-range missile that can carry the nuclear warhead. And that's kind of where they see the end point. That means 2 years of privation, something that they can handle. If you go back to their 1998 launch of their first attempt at a satellite launch, all of the buildup to that happened during what was considered to be the worst famine in North Korea in decades.
The DPRK leadership, and you alluded to this, looks at Libya and Iraq, believes the lessons there. If you give up your nuclear weapons programs, the chances are you'll be toppled. U.S. Representative Tulsi Gabbard from Hawaii suggested a change in U.S. tactics. She said serious diplomacy on the Korean Peninsula will require an end to our regime change war in Syria, in a public statement that the U.S. will not engage in regime change wars and nation building overseas, including in Iran and North Korea. That isn't likely, but is she right? I mean, is that a different approach?
Well, I mean, the idea is that if you at least engage with North Korea, it really couldn't hurt. Throughout the Cold War, the U.S. had regular engagements with the Soviets, even though they were considered the big global enemy on multiple levels. Nonetheless, there was still dialogue and still talk. What's happened in U.S. politics is any discussion with North Korea is now seen as some form of capitulation or appeasement, and therefore it's been completely moved off of the table. It may not be that the United States, through negotiations, can stop the North Koreans' nuclear program, but it may be able to move back from the sense of imminent crisis.
China and Russia, of course, proposing this halt to the military exercises, a freeze on Pyongyang's nuclear and missile programs. The U.S. seems against that, but is that an avenue that should be approached or thought about?
I think the challenge that one has to consider when looking at that as an option for the United States is less about what does that mean for North Korea specifically, and more about what would that mean for the overall reliability of U.S. defense alliance and partnerships around the world. And I think this is where the United States is concerned. Even though the U.S. is still seen as the single largest global power, it's very small compared to the rest of the world. And a lot of its power and strength is based on alliance relationships, and those relationships are based on trusting that the United States would come in and assist these countries if necessary. And if it looks like the U.S. is willing to back down on its security guarantee to South Korea, that could have ripples around the world, and that ultimately could have a larger strategic implication on U.S. policymaking than just the impact on slowing the current Korean crisis.
So to put it simply, no easy answers there. Rodger Baker joining